The canopy above was thick, tangled, and pulsing with life. Strange birds with vibrating throat sacs called out in rhythmic bursts that never seemed to stop. In the distance, deep jungle howls echoed through the trees, layered with crackling insect swarms and the heavy footsteps of nocturnal creatures that never showed their faces. The jungle planet of Narathek 6 wasn't just hostile in temperature or terrain. It was an assault on the senses, particularly sound. Even during daylight, the forest hummed with an almost deliberate intensity. At night, it became deafening. And that was precisely the point. The Galactic Academy's elite interspecies survival program had chosen this planet for the annual multi-race training event. The objective was simple in theory: survive for one local week in the jungle with no outside assistance, no advanced gear, and minimal provisions. But everyone knew the real challenge wasn't hunger or danger. It was sleep. The inability to rest, to recover, to calm the mind amid a storm of chaotic sound, that was what broke the best cadets. And this year's group was already unraveling. The camp was made up of 26 students from 13 different planets, each chosen for top marks in adaptability and resilience. Most were from advanced civilizations, used to life in sterile domes or perfectly engineered environments where silence was synthetically maintained. They had trained in heat, trained in gravity flux, even trained in underwater combat. But nothing had prepared them for noise that crawled into the mind and settled behind the eyes like a living parasite. Each student had been issued a basic pack upon arrival: some protein rations, a single knife, a woven hammock, and a compass that barely functioned under the planet's dense electromagnetic fields. Most cadets had gathered their shelters near the designated base zone, stringing up makeshift covers and trying to replicate the habitats from their homeworlds using alien foliage they didn't fully understand. By the second night, the consequences began to show. The noise intensified with the darkness. Shrill clicks and subsonic pulses came from the trees. Massive flying things beat their wings in unpredictable patterns. Something with a lizard's voice howled a long, slow song that ended in a crash of branches. None of the alien cadets could sleep. One by one, they emerged from their shelters looking hollow-eyed and twitchy. A Zelronian named Grix, whose race had evolved in underground silence, covered his ears with his webbed hands and sat rocking under a tree, whispering to himself. A pair of twin Yulvarians tried to sync their neural frequencies to mute sound, but the forest disrupted their psionic link. One of them vomited and fainted. Only one cadet seemed unaffected: Emma Cortez, the human from Earth. She was shorter than most, plain in appearance, and had arrived with little fanfare. Her file listed her as having field experience in deep forest survival zones on her home planet. Some cadets had scoffed at the idea. Earth was known as a death world, but many believed the term was exaggerated. Now it seemed less like a nickname and more like a quiet warning. Emma hadn't pitched her hammock near the others. Instead, she had wandered off the first evening, machete in hand, and returned only briefly during the day. She spoke little, conserved her energy, and kept her eyes low. But what drew attention wasn't her behavior during the day. It was what didn't happen to her at night. Every morning, while others emerged with pale faces, wild eyes, and barely functioning limbs, she appeared composed. She would stretch slowly, roll her shoulders, drink a cup of boiled leaf water, and check her compass without a word. Her skin was dotted with a few insect bites, and her hair was tangled from sleep, but real, uninterrupted sleep. No one else had closed their eyes for more than an hour since arrival. At first, some assumed she had secret tech hidden in her gear. Others accused her of sneaking sleeping meds. One cadet, a yellow-skinned Bralaxian named Yor, tried to search her pack while she was gone. He found nothing but damp herbs, hand-woven twine, and a bundle of fresh leaves. When she returned and saw him near her things, she said nothing, only stared at him until he walked away. By the third night, whispers about her spread through the exhausted camp like heat lightning. She's cheating. She's immune to sound. She's not even real. Maybe a hologram. Even the instructors, who monitored from invisible drones high in the canopy, took notice. The human was succeeding without technology, without alliances, and without visible strain. But no one dared follow her yet, not out of fear, but out of pride. The alien cadets, raised in cultures that valued intellect and engineered solutions, couldn't accept that an organic trick, a simple Earth-native instinct, might be outsmarting their centuries of innovation. Instead, they redoubled their efforts with their own methods, stuffing plant pulp into ears, building layered walls of bark, even trying to hum their species' lullabies in an attempt to override the ambient noise. Nothing worked. Meanwhile, Emma remained calm. She never tried to explain herself. She didn't offer advice or mock the others. She just disappeared into the forest every evening with a bundle of vines over her shoulder and returned at dawn, rested. On the fourth morning, the situation began to reach a breaking point. One of the cadets, Sira of the kiwi species, whose tall antennae twitched uncontrollably from sonic overstimulation, collapsed while foraging. She was removed from the trial, disqualified due to neuroshock. Another began muttering in his sleep-deprived stupor, eventually attacking a tree that had made a sound he couldn't describe. And Emma? She sat nearby, wrapping a fresh cord of twisted plant fibers into a smooth coil, occasionally glancing upward at the flickering leaves. What no one knew yet, what none of the alien students could have imagined, was that the forest wasn't an obstacle for her. It was familiar. On Earth, she had camped through monsoons in the Amazon. She had slept under tree canopies during cicada breeding seasons and during military drills with thunder cracking above her. Her ears didn't search for silence. They filtered noise like a sieve. But even more than that, Emma understood something the others did not. The forest offered everything she needed, including silence. Not the kind you forced with tech or isolation, but the kind you built with patience and rhythm. She had spent the last few days not only resting, but building. In a few hours, some cadets would follow her out of desperation, and what they would discover would not only challenge their understanding of survival, but of human ingenuity itself. The trial wasn't about enduring chaos. It was about listening to it, and then shaping it into stillness. By the fourth afternoon, the cadets had begun to turn on each other. It wasn't overt hostility, at least not yet, but something subtler. Small arguments flared over foraging paths. Side glances sharpened. Rations were clutched tighter. Those who had once been eager to demonstrate cooperation and interspecies camaraderie now grew quiet, paranoid. Fatigue had gnawed through their discipline like acid on metal, and trust began to dissolve in the thick jungle heat. Grix, the Zelronian, no longer responded when spoken to. He curled his elongated body beneath a wide fern and pressed soft moss into his ear canals, rocking in silence as his claws twitched. His partner from the first night had abandoned him, unable to bear the constant muttering. Yor, the Brelaxian who had once tried to inspect Emma's belongings, now paced endlessly around the camp, his massive frame leaving circular trenches in the soft jungle floor. He hadn't blinked in nearly 2 hours. Cadets were failing without being pulled out, not physically, but mentally. Sleep deprivation didn't announce itself with drama. It crept in, dulled reason, frayed nerves, and pushed cadets into irrational spirals they couldn't escape. It affected speech. It ruined motor coordination. And in the case of Sira, who had been removed that morning, it brought dangerous neurological disruption. Her antennae had vibrated uncontrollably, even as her body shut down. Most cadets now refused to sleep entirely, choosing instead to wait for the sun to rise and bring a fraction of psychological safety. Those who did try barely managed a few fragmented minutes before a roar or shriek ripped through the trees. Some began hallucinating, seeing shadows dart through the undergrowth or hearing names whispered from branches that shouldn't have mouths. Emma remained an enigma. She no longer spent any time in the shared camp during the night and only visited briefly during the day to collect foliage or check on the small pot she used to boil water. Her eyes were clearer than anyone's, her steps steady. No one dared accuse her anymore. She had become a quiet force, untouchable, while the rest of the cadets were unraveling. But whispers persisted. Among the most restless was a cadet named Larth. He was a Mivaran, tall, pale blue, and reptilian in physiology. Mivarans were highly sensitive to sonic vibrations. His training had included complex noise-filtering rituals, and until this mission, he had been considered one of the best in sensory resistance. But this planet had proven immune to his techniques. The jungle sounds didn't follow any discernible pattern. There was no rhythm to predict, no frequency to block. His skin had begun to peel from stress. His pupils were permanently dilated, and he hated Emma more with each passing hour. He wasn't the only one growing obsessed. Near sunset, while Yor was dragging a fallen branch to reinforce his shelter walls, he stopped, straightened, and looked toward the path Emma always took at dusk. His jaw twitched. A second later, he followed it, slowly, methodically, like a predator trying not to alert its prey. Larth noticed. He didn't speak but joined him. They weren't alone for long. 3 other cadets, Rylan from RS9, the Yulvarian twin still able to function, and a mechanical-eyed student from Traxxas, broke off from the group and followed behind without coordination or a word spoken. Desperation had united them. They needed answers. They needed to see what she had built. The jungle beyond the camp wasn't welcoming. The moment the cadets stepped beyond the proximity of their communal shelters, the sounds seemed to grow louder, as if the forest recognized the absence of numbers and took pleasure in isolating them. Vines brushed their limbs. Shrill bird-like screeches pierced the trees. A branch snapped from above, and all 5 flinched simultaneously. Still, they pressed on. Emma's trail wasn't obvious. She had taken great care not to damage the environment around her. But there were signs if one paid attention. A broken stalk here, a slightly shifted stone there, a change in wind direction. Yor picked up on it first. His nose was broader than most, and he grunted once before pushing forward into a dense thicket of vine-covered trunks. There it was. The group emerged into a clearing tucked between 2 natural hills, hidden from aerial view by the overlapping canopy. And in the center stood Emma's shelter. It wasn't a tent. It wasn't a hut. It was something else, something organic and fluid, as though it had grown from the ground itself. Large, wide leaves had been woven together in overlapping layers, forming rounded walls that rose no more than shoulder height. The shelter had no straight lines. Everything was curved, circular, shaped by hand. A sunken entry, half buried in soil, led to what appeared to be a pit structure, covered with interlocking mats of mud-packed foliage. Thick vines formed ribs along the exterior, binding the walls together with tension so precise it looked engineered. But the most striking part wasn't how it looked. It was what it didn't do. The moment the cadets stepped near it, the noise changed. The omnipresent roar of jungle life that had screamed in their ears for days began to muffle. As Yor reached forward and brushed his hand across the shelter wall, the sound of his breath became clearer in his ears, the rustle of his tunic, the hum inside his skull. Everything outside the shelter became background. For the first time since the trial began, he heard only himself. Larth staggered forward. His eyes widened. He reached the entrance, knelt, and pulled the leaf flap aside. Inside, Emma sat cross-legged on a woven mat. A fireless pot steamed slightly beside her, and she was adjusting a small wall segment near her feet. She didn't startle. She didn't flinch. She looked up, blinked once, and gave a slow nod. No one spoke. Not because they were afraid, but because words didn't seem necessary. She gestured for them to enter. One by one, they stepped inside. The change was immediate and total. The shelter was cool, insulated. The noise of the outside world became a whisper, as though someone had draped thick woolen blankets over the sky. The floor was padded with compacted mulch and fern fiber. The ceiling, a tight dome of layered leaves sealed with clay, absorbed every vibration. There were no windows, only breathing holes aligned to let in air but deflect sound. It was perfect. Larth dropped to his knees and exhaled for the first time in hours. Yor sat down heavily, elbows on his thighs. Rylan touched the walls repeatedly, running his fingers along the textured patterns. No one asked how Emma had done it. It was obvious that whatever this was, it hadn't been improvised. It had been intentional, methodical, and rooted in knowledge none of them possessed. Emma finally spoke, her voice low, even. "You can stay tonight. Just don't break anything." She returned to her weaving. The leaves in her hands were fresh, trimmed, still sticky with sap. Her fingers moved with practiced rhythm, threading the next piece into the wall like a seamstress finishing a garment. She didn't explain what species the plants came from or how she had discovered which absorbed sound best. She didn't tell them that she had mapped wind patterns to angle the structure away from sonic corridors in the trees. She simply worked. The cadets remained still, wrapped in silence like it was a forgotten luxury. And when night fell, and the jungle came alive again with its endless orchestra of screams, clicks, and howls, none of them heard it. Inside Emma's shelter, the noise never entered. By morning, everything would be different. Dawn on Narathek 6 arrived not with soft light, but with a sudden blaze of heat. The planet's sun surged above the treetops in a burst of golden fire, and the ever-humming forest responded like a chorus jarred awake. The shrieks of dawn creatures ricocheted through the canopy, their overlapping voices forming a wall of sound that battered the jungle floor. But in the hidden grove, beneath a carefully crafted dome of leaves and clay, 5 cadets remained undisturbed. They slept for the first time in days, deep, dreamless, healing sleep. Emma awoke first. She always did. Her body was trained by habit and survival instinct. As her eyes opened, she instinctively checked the temperature of the air, the density of the moisture, and the weight of silence around her. Her fingers reached up to the inner roof of her shelter, gently tapping it to feel for dew accumulation. Minimal. The insulation had held. She rose quietly, stepping around the others with careful precision. Larth was curled near the wall, his usually taut muscles now slack. Yor snored softly beside the entrance. Rylan slept with his hands still folded in front of his chest, as if guarding the peace he had found. Emma noted their positions, their breathing, and then stepped out of the shelter. The noise of the jungle returned like a crashing wave. It never stopped, only faded behind the layers of leaf and earth. Emma didn't flinch. Her ears had long since adapted to the barrage. Instead, she moved toward the base of the hill and crouched near a set of flat stones where she had placed a drying mat. Leaves collected the night before had drained excess moisture and now waited to be woven. She picked them up one by one, checking for flexibility, tearing away veins too thick to fold. Behind her, the flap of the shelter stirred. Yor stepped out, blinking into the daylight. He looked dazed, blinking hard, as if unsure the calm of the night had truly happened. His body, large and broad-shouldered, sagged with the weight of relief. He turned slowly and looked at the structure from the outside. For the first time, he saw it in full light. What had seemed like a pile of jungle material under moonlight now revealed itself as a masterpiece of design. The walls curved like the shell of a forest creature, each leaf layered in a specific angle that deflected wind and moisture. The clay segments had hardened slightly overnight, forming a tight seal where the joints met. Vines wrapped the dome like tendons, stretched and tied in ways that flexed with the planet's regular seismic shivers. There wasn't a single piece of synthetic material. It was all natural, yet flawless in function. Emma said nothing. She continued weaving. Yor approached and crouched beside her. He watched her hands move, quick, deliberate, almost meditative. He didn't ask questions immediately. That was new for him. His species was known for bluntness, for physicality, for a lack of subtlety. But here, in this pocket of calm, even Yor's massive presence seemed subdued. "How long?" he finally asked, his voice gruff from disuse. "3 nights to finish the main structure," she answered without pausing. 5 to make it perfect." He nodded slowly, digesting the information. Others began to stir. Rylan emerged, then Larth, rubbing his arms and looking less haunted. The twin from the Yulvarian pair followed, her silvery skin glinting in the sunlight. She didn't speak either, only stood in silence, taking in the sounds and textures that now felt muted after a night in the dome. Emma rose, brushing off her palms. She handed Yor the piece of vine she had been working on. "Here, pull this through, then bend it under the second knot. Keep the curve tight." He obeyed without hesitation. That was the moment it began. Not just appreciation, but participation. One by one, the cadets stepped forward, watching, copying, asking for clarification. Emma taught without lecturing. She spoke only when needed, corrected with gestures, and let the others learn by repetition. When someone failed to thread a leaf correctly, she simply demonstrated again. The others didn't notice the shift at first, but by mid-morning, more cadets began arriving. Word had spread, carried by instinct, rumor, or perhaps something deeper. No one had slept the night before in the main camp. Some had heard that Emma had found a way. Others had been told of a structure built from leaves that silenced the forest. The reality surpassed every version of the rumor. By noon, there were 13 cadets sitting in a semicircle outside Emma's shelter. Some still trembled with exhaustion. Others looked near collapse. Emma didn't turn them away. She divided tasks. 2 were sent to collect wide leaves with specific textures. Another group was assigned to fetch clay from the nearby riverbank. She showed the rest how to weave base layers. There was no resistance. No one scoffed at her methods or tried to override her instructions. Authority had shifted. It hadn't been seized. It had been earned. Even the instructors, monitoring through silent orbiting drones, registered the development with interest. Emma's file had mentioned high scores in practical fieldwork and emotional regulation, but nothing had prepared them for this. She had not only survived the trial, she had turned it into a classroom. As the cadets worked, Emma explained little details that transformed their understanding of survival. She described how different plant fibers dampened or reflected sound depending on their moisture levels. She pointed out that domes absorbed vibrations better than walls. She instructed them to use mulch beneath the sleeping areas to prevent ground resonance. Every piece had a reason. Every decision came from experience. Larth, who had initially followed her out of suspicion, was now her most focused assistant. He handled the inner lining of the new shelter, using his elongated fingers to place each layer with obsessive precision. Yor began lifting entire tree limbs to create a framework for a second dome. Rylan wrote notes in the dirt with a stick, mapping airflow directions based on canopy gaps. The jungle had not changed. It still screamed, hissed, and pulsed with alien life. But Emma had taught the cadets how to listen differently. She had shown them that the forest wasn't trying to kill them. It was simply speaking in its own language, and like any language, it could be navigated, understood, even softened. By sunset, 2 more shelters stood beside Emma's. They weren't as perfect, but they held form. Inside, cadets tested them by sitting in silence. When the forest howled and they didn't flinch, some began to laugh, not out of amusement, but out of sheer release. They hadn't remembered what calm felt like. As the second night fell, and the jungle roared again with its relentless, chaotic chorus, more than half the cadets had found refuge. The central camp lay half empty. Those who had resisted, who had clung to their gear and protocols, began to feel the pressure. Pride was no match for exhaustion. Emma stood beneath the canopy, her arms folded, watching the stars pierce through the shifting leaves. She didn't smile. She didn't gloat. She had done what she came to do. Not to dominate, not to impress, but to survive, and to show others how to survive without breaking. The jungle had forced every cadet to confront their limits, but Emma had looked past the noise and found harmony. And now, one by one, others were learning to do the same. In the coming days, the trial would transform entirely. But the shift had begun here, in this clearing, with leaves, mud, and the quiet persistence of a girl who knew how to listen. The next morning brought a transformation that even Emma hadn't anticipated. The jungle's voice still screamed at the rising sun, as it always did, shrill, layered, and overwhelming. But the cadets no longer staggered beneath its weight. Inside the expanding cluster of domed shelters, those who had slept stirred slowly and emerged with clearer minds. Around the clearing, the rhythm of coordinated motion had replaced the chaos of fatigue. The cadets were no longer reacting to the environment. They were shaping it. Emma stood quietly near the edge of the grove, arms crossed over her chest, watching as cadets divided into teams without needing to be told. A small group, led by Rylan, moved toward the river to gather more clay, carrying woven baskets made from twisted vines. Another team, including Larth and the Universehfy girl, examined the canopy angles and adjusted the positions of the new shelters being constructed to face away from dominant sound corridors. Even Yor, whose brute strength had once served no higher purpose than intimidation, was gently threading thick fern stems through skeletal frames with surprising finesse. She didn't command them. She didn't need to. She had shown them the structure, the pattern, the logic. Now they were replicating and refining it, each in their own way. A few instructors, still hidden from sight, began annotating their observations more actively. The trial had shifted from a test of endurance into a living experiment in knowledge transfer, problem-solving, and cultural integration. It was no longer about survival. It had become a study of adaptation. And at the center of it all stood the human who had not uttered more than a few dozen words since the trial began. Midday arrived with oppressive humidity. Thunderclouds churned above the canopy, threatening another of Narethek 6's famous soundstorms. The cadets knew what that meant: sonic pressure waves, echo bursts, and auditory disorientation. In previous years, storms like these had broken the morale of even the strongest groups. But this time, preparations were already in motion. Emma walked along the newly formed inner ring of shelters and checked the tension of each dome's frame. She tugged gently at the vines supporting one of the structures, then rewrapped a loose binding with fluid precision. She knelt beside the smallest of the shelters, where two younger cadets from a lesser-known species had struggled to complete their work. She didn't scold. She removed the top layer herself, handed each of them a new leaf mat, and showed them how to secure it to the frame without shifting the internal pressure balance. Her hands worked faster than theirs, but she never rushed them. When the first thunder cracked over the canopy, no one flinched. Inside the shelters, cadets braced themselves against the sudden shift in air pressure, but no screams followed, no panicked scrambling, no collapses. The dome structures flexed but did not fall. Inside, the sound reduced to a muffled tremor, like distant drums underwater. Some cadets remained outside, choosing instead to observe the storm and study its effects. Larth took notes on leaf vibration rates. Yor placed his palm flat against the outer wall of a shelter and nodded with a grunt as it held firm. The Universehfy girl crouched near the base of one dome, watching how rainwater diverted into the clay channels Emma had embedded into the design. For the first time, the cadets weren't afraid of the storm. They were curious. Emma stood beneath a natural awning she had fashioned from overlapping ferns and observed the sky. Her body remained still, but her mind was active. She was already considering improvements. The shelters worked, but some leaked slightly under direct rainfall. She would need a better sealing technique at the top joint. perhaps using double-wrapped fiber knots with crushed sap resin between layers. That might bond better under heat. Her thoughts were interrupted when an unexpected voice called out from the tree line. "Emma!" the voice rasped, cracking from lack of sleep. It was Heron, a cadet from the technologically advanced world of Calzar Prime. His skin shimmered faintly even in the dim light, and his breathing was uneven. He stumbled into the grove, soaked and half delirious. "I couldn't sleep. I couldn't think. I heard—" He paused, eyes scanning the domes. "I heard you built something that stops the forest." Emma stepped toward him. "Not stops it," she said gently. "Just quiets it." He looked at her with disbelief, then at the others working in silence. His jaw clenched. "I was top-ranked in acoustic simulation. I spent 2 years training in hypersonic tunnels, and I was defeated by noise." His shoulders sagged. "And you made it out of leaves." Emma didn't reply. Instead, she motioned to the last unfinished frame on the edge of the clearing. "Help me finish that. You'll understand." He followed her without protest. The others watched but said nothing. The grove had become more than a survival camp. It had turned into a place of quiet apprenticeship. Each cadet who entered carried pride, frustration, or fear. But each emerged with something unexpected: humility, understanding, and a sense of shared learning that crossed planetary and cultural divides. By evening, the last dome was complete. Heron stood beside it, his expression unreadable. He pressed his palm to the inner wall and closed his eyes. For several long seconds, he said nothing. Then he looked at Emma. "This isn't primitive," he said. "It's genius." She gave him a slight nod, then returned to her shelter. The others followed her lead. As night fell, every cadet found a place within the new structures. No one slept on the ground. No one trembled. For the first time since arriving on Narethek 6, the entire class entered the night prepared. The storm returned with renewed force after dusk, bringing with it banshee winds and a low-frequency pulse that made the canopy ripple like the surface of a black ocean. But the shelters held. Inside, the cadets slept. Emma lay awake for a while, listening, not to the chaos, but to the silence she had helped create. Around her, breath patterns slowed. The human girl from Earth, once dismissed as fragile or irrelevant, had not only endured, she had rewritten the challenge. This jungle, designed to break minds through sound, had become a classroom. She had turned the language of the forest into architecture, and in doing so, she had taught others a new way to survive, not through force or tech, but through observation, patience, and craft. The storm would pass, but the lesson would remain. The morning after the great storm, the jungle emerged steaming and glistening, draped in veils of mist and dripping with the residue of sound. Narethek 6 had unleashed one of its most violent tempests overnight, and yet for the first time in the history of the Galactic Academy's interspecies survival trials, not a single cadet had failed during a storm. No one had been withdrawn. No one had broken down. Inside the leaf and clay domes built with Emma's design, 26 cadets had made it through, sleeping soundly through a storm that once brought even the strongest to their knees. Emma stepped outside her shelter before the others stirred. The ground was soft with water, and the air still hummed with residual energy from the previous night. Her boots sank slightly into the mud as she walked to the edge of the grove, where the new shelters formed a wide ring. Some were built with more skill than others, but all had held. Not a single structure had collapsed or leaked. Even the ones assembled under rushed conditions by the most skeptical cadets had done their job. She took a slow breath, watching as clouds of steam curled upward from the soaked underbrush. The air felt quiet in a way that went beyond volume. It was a deeper kind of silence, a stillness earned, not given. The kind that comes after a trial passed. The instructors made themselves visible for the first time since the beginning of the course. Drones landed on thin-legged tripods around the perimeter, and one of the program's lead evaluators, a pale crystalline being named Vorex, descended from the observation craft, his shimmering form hovering slightly above the mud. He was known for his emotionless demeanor and rigid expectations. The cadets respected him, but most feared his judgment. He was rarely impressed. Now he glided across the clearing, scanning the shelter ring and the cadets emerging from within it. The students stood straighter when they saw him. They weren't fully rested, Narathex never allowed that, but they were grounded now, alert, focused. Vorex spoke in a tone as even as glass. Initial evaluation reports: 0 dropouts, 0 medical interventions, 98% retention of pre-storm coordination protocols. He paused, observing Emma for a moment longer than the others. The curriculum parameters were not designed for this outcome. Emma didn't react. He turned slowly, addressing the group. Explain the deviation. It was Larth who stepped forward, his posture steady and voice firm. We adapted. Emma Cortez demonstrated an acoustic engineering solution that surpassed the standard expectations of the exam. Using native materials, she developed an effective soundproof shelter. She taught us. We replicated it. Vorex remained still. You learned from a cadet. You abandoned tech. You used leaves. Yor took a step forward next to Larth. We didn't abandon anything. We evolved. A murmur of agreement passed through the group. The cadets now stood unified. Species from across the galaxy, speaking not from fear or duty, but from shared understanding. Their hierarchy had reshaped itself through action, not by force, not through rank, but through practical wisdom. Vorex's crystalline form shimmered faintly, unreadable. Earth's contribution to survival protocols is rarely prioritized. Explain why her method proved superior. It was Rylan who answered this time. Because she didn't fight the jungle, she listened to it. The evaluator paused again, longer this time. Then, without comment, he began scanning the shelters, touching each wall with a delicate sensor. As he completed the circuit, the data streamed onto the translucent panels attached to his arm. After several minutes of silent analysis, he turned once more to the group. Effective insulation, sound absorption rate above 90% in storm-level frequencies, structural integrity maintained under shifting atmospheric pressure, construction time minimal, energy input negligible. He looked at Emma directly now. This design will be submitted to the High Council for review. You have altered the nature of the Narathex trial. Emma nodded once, her hands at her sides. Vorex's gaze lingered another second. Then he rotated away. Final evaluations begin in 1 hour. Prepare for extraction. As he left, the group remained still, absorbing the weight of what had just happened. Emma exhaled quietly, stepping back toward the center of the grove. The others turned to her, not with awe, but with respect. She didn't meet their eyes. She didn't want praise. She simply wanted to be useful, to make things work. She had succeeded in that. The extraction process was swift. Within the hour, the instructors began dismantling the outer perimeters, and the cadets gathered their supplies. Some attempted to preserve fragments of their shelters, leaf panels, bindings, diagrams etched into bark. Yor carried an entire roof segment under one arm. Larth collected soil samples from beneath the dome floor. Rylan copied Emma's mud mixture proportions into his digital pad. As the shuttle lifted from the surface, the jungle below grew smaller, the grove fading into a soft green patch among the dense forest. The trial was over. Back at the academy, the cadets underwent debriefing. Instructors interviewed each participant separately, but the story was the same every time. No tech, no shortcuts, just a method born from ancient Earth-based knowledge, applied with patience and clarity. The soundproof leaf shelter was already being studied by engineering faculty and environmental design committees. Within weeks, a new module would be added to the interspecies survival program: primitive structural acoustics, field application case, Narathex 6, Cortez protocol. Emma didn't attend the announcement ceremony. She was back in the Academy's biome lab, working quietly in a corner, testing how off-world fibers reacted to synthetic rainfall. She barely noticed when Vorax entered. He didn't speak at first, only watched as she adjusted the angle of the basin to redirect water runoff. "You did not submit a formal post-trial report," he finally said. Emma kept working. "I didn't know what to write." "You changed the outcome of a standardized exam." "I didn't intend to," she replied. "I just wanted to sleep." Vorax's features sparkled faintly under the lab lights. "There is elegance in necessity. You will be offered a mentorship position. Others will want to learn." Emma hesitated, then met his eyes. "Will they listen?" He paused. "Now?" "Yes." She nodded once and turned back to her work. Outside the lab, the Academy's holographic board displayed new rotation schedules. The Narethek 6 trial was being re-evaluated. Earth-based cadet applications had spiked by 38%. A research proposal titled Silent Survival, Low-Tech Acoustic Engineering in Hostile Environments had just been funded. And in the quiet of the lab, beneath the hum of artificial light, Emma continued shaping leaves, this time not to survive, but to teach. The jungle had spoken. She had answered. And now, the galaxy was listening.